Okay, we're recording. Um, my name's Thomas Brown. I'm here with Ryan Moore, who is running for Ward 8. Ward 8, City Council, Ward 8 in Eugene, Oregon. Um, I'm with SAN, the Solidarity Action Network, and we're affiliated with ESSN, the Eugene Springfield Solidarity Network. We're going to let Ryan. Oh yeah. We're not doing this as an endorsement of any. We don't endorse any candidates, but due to the COVID-19 lockdown or isolation, we're giving the candidates a opportunity to present themselves to the public and answer a few questions about their position on some of the issues. And with that, take it away. You want to talk for 4 minutes, Ryan?
I don't know if it'll be 4 minutes, but sure, I can start off.
Yeah, tell us what you want, what your reason for running is, and how you can improve the city.
For sure. Well, actually, first, running a campaign is very strange in these times. So forums like this are great. Thank you for taking the initiative to set it up. It's harder to reach voters these days.
Yeah, we wanted to do this just because of that. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, my name's Ryan Moore. I'm a candidate for Eugene City Council in Ward 8, which is basically the southwest corner of the city, that whole chunk. I'll start by talking about sort of why I decided to run to get into this race, and then what I think makes me qualified to fill this seat. So my partner and I were forced out of our last home because we couldn't afford rent anymore. And so we were thrown into the depths of the housing crisis, and we searched and searched and searched for any place we could afford to move to. And there was just nothing available, nothing at all. And I think this is important because this is a really recurring story across Eugene, even before the pandemic hit, and it's only going to get worse because of it. Now, my partner and I, we were lucky at the final hour to find a really beautiful apartment. We love it here, and we're really lucky, but a lot of people aren't so lucky who are in that boat. And I think that's important to realize because if you look at our current city council right now, none of them have that experience. And at the same time, our council is the local government body that is empowered to do a whole lot of good stuff potentially to address the housing crisis. So it seems vital to me that we would have someone who has gone through this experience themselves in the room helping make those decisions. So that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and made me decide to run for this seat. Tom, this won't be news to you, but I've been involved for years in the community. Whether it's right now I serve on the city's budget committee. I've actively pushed for better solutions to the housing crisis, unhoused services, and ways to address climate change. I worked in the state legislature during the 2019 session as a legislative aide for State Representative John Lively. And Rep. Lively, he was on, well, first he chaired the Committee on Economic Development, which is a very big deal in these times as we prepared for a long recovery. He also served on the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction, which drafted the big, House Bill 2020, which was supposed to be this big response to climate change at the state level. It was a cap and trade program, essentially. Ultimately, it died in the Senate, but I had a good opportunity to work in that office and sort of see that bill through the entire process, start to finish. Rep. Lively also served on the committee that put together the Student Success Act, which, is a key piece to funding our education system and sort of recovering from historical disinvestments. In terms of community volunteerism, there's a lot. I serve on the board at Laurel Hill Center, which is a nationally recognized mental health nonprofit. We also are involved in what's called the FUSE program, which stands for Frequent User System Engagement. This essentially is the program that's focused at our highest risk, highest need populations. Many of the people that are served in that program are unhoused, if not all of them. Laurel Hill Center specifically handles the street outreach portion. So we're approaching people where they're at in the community, on the street, trying to get them engaged in services and on the path back into housing. So I've done that. I also co-founded a couple nonprofits. One, you'll know, Tom, our Revolution Lane County, spent a lot of time there. I also co-founded the Springfield Eugene Tenant Association, which there's no other organization in our whole region that does the sort of work we do at CETA. We operate a tenant hotline that a renter can call with any question under the sun, whether it's something about an eviction, a landlord issue, or even something simple like, how do I clean my carpets up to standard, right? And if we don't have the answer to that question, we can refer out to places like Lane County Legal Aid or a whole host of other resources in the community. So my point in bringing all that up is I've been involved in these fights for years, long before I ever decided to run or even thought about running for office. I am not running for office and then starting to care about these fights. I'm in these fights, and because of that, running for office. And I think that's important to have that, again, real background in these issues represented on council, especially as we head into a really stressful time where some important decisions are going to be made that affect people like me. We'll get in later, I think, about, some of the other reasons why I think I'm most suitable for this seat. But for now, I guess we can turn to the next question.
Yeah, it sounds like you're a busy guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it doesn't take a crystal ball to see that our current recession will exacerbate Eugene's affordable housing crisis and force yet more residents onto the streets. How will you respond to the immediate spike in homelessness and the housing instability, and what measures will you take over the long term to help Eugene's unhoused?
Yeah. So this is a big question. I'll try and be relatively brief. Again, I've been working on this issue for years already, whether it's on the city's budget committee, where I pushed for a faster implementation of what's called the TAP report. It's basically this big strategy that the county and the city partnered up, and this consultant that was hired estimated if we fully invested in this plan, followed it to a T, we would have no permanent unsheltered population within 3 years. Now, we're not able to fully invest, we're not able to fully follow it to a T, but I have from the get-go been pushing for us to do as much as we can on that. And I've had some success. Now, another piece where I've been working on this is at the Springfield Eugene Tenant Association. If you go and look at the data from local service providers, exactly who are the people who are, unhoused, living on the streets in our community. There are some common narratives, but if you look at the data, by and large, these people were local renters before they lost their access to housing for whatever reason. And so at CETA, our core mission is focused on helping people stay in their homes, right? So we're addressing, the unhoused crisis from that angle, trying to narrow the number of people that are losing access to their housing and being forced out onto the street. Let's see. The second piece that I think is really important as we look at recovery is going to be something we've already been, our current city council has already been doing, I think, a good job at, which is small business assistance. And this is important because in this recovery, it's going to be critical to keep people in their jobs to the best extent we can. And the way we do that is by keeping as many of our local small businesses afloat as we can to keep people employed. So the city and the county have established a small business assistance fund. There's also some state and federal assistance that has come in, and more will be on the way, I think. But I think in the short term, the role city council can fill in that is being a sort of guide for those funds and that support that comes in from the state and federal level. This is obviously too big of a challenge for the city to tackle on its own. We're going to need a lot of help, more than just a $1,200 check from the federal government. It's going to take more than that. And council, I think, is well suited to serve as sort of guides to that support to direct it where it's needed most in the community. Let's see. Yeah, so that's kind of the immediate impacts. In the medium and long term, you know, most of our tax revenue locally comes from property taxes. And that revenue stream is a bit more insulated from the crisis than something like a sales tax would be. We would feel more immediate effects from that diminishing. So the impact of a property tax decline is going to be felt in the more medium and long term. And I've been watching our city council discussions very closely over the last couple of weeks. They are prepared for that pretty well. I know from being on the budget committee that we've already built up substantial reserves. We've been readying ourselves for an economic recession for a while now. I don't think anyone predicted it would be as bad as it's going to be because of this pandemic, but we aren't in the worst position. So I know I've already talked enough on this one, but I've thought a lot about, you know, how are we going to track how bad it's going to be? I think one of the biggest early warning signs for the severity of the economic crisis coming from this pandemic is going to be our rate of foreclosures. If we can get an eye and see that more and more people are losing their homes, that's going to immediately translate into declining property tax revenue, which then is going to take a bite out of all of the core services that we fund from that revenue. And so looking at our foreclosure rates, if we start to see an uptick in that, I think, well, certainly I'm ready to meet that immediately with a big upfront stimulus, because if we can head off that, it'll save us money in the long run if property tax doesn't decline as much. I'm being kind of long-winded, so I'll cut off there and just go to the next question.
This is your time.
All right.
Yeah. So with the economy just got blindsided, you know. So no one could plan for this, and so there's a lot of people out there who aren't going to be able to make their mortgage payments. They aren't going to be able to make their rent payments.
Mm-hmm.
And even if since there's a lack of money in the, you know, lack of disposable income in the community, the businesses are going to be slow coming back. So this, I don't see this. This is a disaster, a slow motion disaster, in my opinion. So last June, the city council voted to implement a payroll tax in Eugene. They also decided not to refer this controversial tax to the voters. What is your stance on the payroll taxes? And how do you agree? And do you agree with the council's decision not to allow voters to weigh in on the tax?
Yeah. So this is a two-part question, but I want to start by saying people in Ward 8 have seen the very clear need for better funding for community safety. We have suffered from property crimes for a while, and we've seen how EPD is not able to respond to, maybe not most, but a huge chunk of the calls that come in. I saw one figure that citywide, at least, EPD could only respond to about 30% of the calls that they received per service. And so before I dive into the answer to the question, I want to acknowledge that I think there is, or there was, a need for something to help boost community safety in Eugene. Now, looking at the payroll tax specifically, I think council should have done more to protect low-wage workers. I know that minimum wage was exempted and there's a lower rate, I think up to people who make $15 an hour. I would have pushed hard for a more progressive scale than that. I think that even if you're making $15 an hour, you know, rents are so high right now, the cost of living is just so high that even that, if you're taking a bite out of that with a payroll tax, can have a big impact. So if I had been on council, that's something I would have pushed for. But even before this proposal got to that point, I think where we should have had more public engagement is in the run-up when this whole proposal was being drafted in the first place. There was a committee, I don't know if this has been talked about a lot, I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it, but there was a committee that examined a whole table of options, and they arrived at this form of tax being the most suitable for the current time. I don't know how much public involvement there was in that, but that's also a sign of what I'm talking about, right? Ideally, we would have had very public discussions, people would have had ample opportunity to give their input, and because that didn't exist, we then see this outcry now after it's already been passed. So first off, I think before we ever start talking about raising taxes in the future, we ought to look at ways that we can save on costs instead. So when I say that, that's kind of vague, but things like cahoots, which saves a lot of money. Instead of sending out a police unit to respond to a call that involves a mental health crisis, we send cahoots. We not only create better outcomes, we also save a lot of money that way. So creative ways to tackle these problems should be examined before we look at raising taxes. And I think that's just common sense. Kind of lost track of my thoughts. Short to say, I'm not happy, like many people in Eugene, with how that went. But I'm not on council yet.
Yeah, there's a need to keep tighter track of where the dollars are going, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah.
Eugene has one of the worst affordable housing shortages in the country. What approach should the city take to resolving our housing crisis?
Yeah. And this is one of my core issues. I think, you know, it's really easy to talk about this problem and to say things that sound good to people, but if you don't follow it up with action to actually meet what you're talking about, it doesn't do anyone any good. And I think that's the boat we're in right now. Getting specific, if you look at something like the perennial battle over accessory dwelling units, these are also called granny flats. Basically, you know, a person can build a small unit in their backyard or above their garage or in their basement. Right now, due to zoning and fees, it's just not feasible in most cases for someone to do that. And so something we've been arguing over in Eugene for years is how do we carve away at these barriers and make it easier and get more people building these things. Now, there's been a lot of talk, but not a lot of action on that. And this gets at why I'm running for council in the first place, right? We don't have someone on council who's been through the housing crisis. And I think that experience sort of gives me a bit more motivation. I certainly feel that it's an urgent threat more than an academic question. I'm not just talking about this, reading about it on paper. I've actually been through it myself. And I think having that level of motivation to actually implement some of these things will, well, the goal at least is to change the dynamic of the argument on council. And I'm the only candidate that brings that for the seat. So that's very personal to me. There's also another important dimension of this, in that the way I think that we build more affordable housing, small A affordable housing, is look at ways to build smaller housing, right? And so like I said, ADUs are one way. There are also things like single room occupancy complexes. They're also called residential hotels, a series of bedrooms who share common areas like living rooms and kitchens. These tend to take a fraction of the cost to build than a conventional apartment. And the result of that is you can then turn around and rent it for much cheaper than a conventional apartment. Problem is, right now in most of Eugene, it's not legal to build that sort of structure. And so, again, my motivation is informed by my background, and these are the things that I can be counted on to push for. You know, I'm glad to see that the discussion in Eugene has now moved to a place where we seem to openly acknowledge the need for increased density along transit corridors. That's a great start, but the discussion shouldn't end there. And I'm hoping we can go further, and certainly I'd push for that if on council. There is another intersection, and I'll be brief with this. There's another intersection with climate change on this, by the way. If you build smaller housing, it's going to take less energy to heat and maintain that home. It's going to take less furnishings to fill it and make it feel like a home. And just looking at building a smaller house, it takes less materials. In all of those ways, you end up emitting far less carbon into the atmosphere. And so my thinking is it's not only a better idea to build smaller housing from an affordability perspective, but also from a climate perspective. It's more environmentally sustainable. And I mean, people know all about missing middle these days and how we have a dearth of, you know, things like duplexes or triplexes. We haven't kept pace with population growth. But I think we also have to weave in discussion of climate change in this because, I mean, they go hand in hand, really.
Yeah, it should be every other word should be something about climate change.
Yeah.
But yeah, there'd be with the multiple family dwellings, you know, on the transit corridors, like you're saying. The only problem I can see is parking. You know, what do you do with the vehicles? You know.
And we have, if I can cut in, we have a good example up in Portland that they did a study recently. In a downtown area, they were looking at what are the different price points for building new forms of housing. And so they were looking at, if you require parking per unit, the most feasible thing for a developer to build would be, I think, 4 sort of upscale apartments. If you then remove that parking requirement, and keep in mind this is a downtown area with great access to public transit, if you remove the parking requirement, suddenly the most profitable or feasible thing to build for a developer would be something like a 40-unit apartment building. And so if we can find places where there's great access to transit, where maybe bike paths, where people are not as reliant on cars, I think there's such need right now that those units would be filled almost instantly. And a side effect of the no parking requirement is that we could build a lot cheaper and rent it for lower rates. And so not requiring parking is, in my eyes, not always a bad thing. I get the fear that we're going to have overcrowded streets, and that's definitely something we all want to avoid. But there are ways I think we can do this that don't result in that. And Portland has given us a good example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Move on to another question here. The need to incentivize affordable housing development can place landowners, developers, affordable housing activists, and labor groups at odds. How will you manage the conflict between the 1% and the rest of the community?
Yeah. So again, I think, you know, the core of this question is a question about trust. People want to know that they have representatives that will fight for them when they're put in a position where they're competing interests. And so, you know, again, I've got that track record of already being involved in these struggles, whether it's, you know, I support, for example, the Oregon People's Rebate, which is essentially make some of the biggest corporations that do business in Oregon start to pay their fair share and use that to support families in Oregon. Right now, we have corporations like Comcast, for example, that end up paying $0 in state taxes year after year. And that's just not right. So I guess what I'm getting at is my best answer is I've already been doing this work, and I think I've proven where my dedication lies. And um, I don't know, does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, the Oregon People's Rebate, that would actually be a huge injection of uh, liquidity into the local economy. Make a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. And I think
Um,
that
Go ahead.
the key there too is that it's only aimed at these huge mega corporations, right? We're not talking about small businesses at all,
No,
even
no, it's
remotely.
anything over
We're talking
25
about
million.
corporations that skate by without paying anything into the system, and at the same time, they benefit tremendously from the system. You know, Comcast couldn't do business if we didn't have an educated workforce, and yet they're not paying into the system to help support our education system, and that's just not right. Um, anyway, I'll get off my high horse.
Well, we need a few more high horses
Yeah.
on our side.
Right.
So um, I find the term affordable housing is kind of misleading. You know, it's affordable. Um, Actually, that's a
Yep.
relative term. You know, it's low income would be more accurate. You know, for a lot of what we're talking about here. So, how would you ensure that every income bracket has housing availability? What would you how would you institute that kind of thing? Income, what do you call it? Income-based housing or something? I
Right.
don't know. How would you do that?
Yeah, so first off, affordable housing, the standard sort of legal definition is 60% area median income. Now, average rent right now is market rate rent is $1,200 a month, which is not sustainable, especially if you look at people my age, low wage earners, or people on Social Security or disability. There's no way that people can find housing in that sort of market. And so, again, yeah, you kind of caught me out. I meant to emphasize that affordable doesn't necessarily mean what it should mean, right? And so when we're talking about how do we get people who are on low incomes access to housing, it's a lot of what we've been talking about the last 20 minutes or so. My idea is build smaller housing in different forms, re-legalize things that are not legal to build right now, or at least not economically feasible. There's a program up north, a city, they have a revolving loan program for low-income property owners to use to build an accessory dwelling unit, so long as they then commit to renting that ADU out to another low-income resident. So with that, you've got a win-win in that you're helping a low-income person, property owner, establish a bit more income to sustain themselves, while then also guaranteeing housing to another low-income resident. And, I think that's a great solution here. We've got great organizations like Dev Northwest, who I think would be ideal to spearhead it. But to make it happen, we've got to follow through on what we've been talking about and make it feasible to build ADUs. I could talk for hours about this issue specifically, but suffice to say, I think on that, it's a question of motivation, and I've got it in spades.
Oh, good. So, final question. What is your vision for the city, and as an elected representative, what role will you play in bringing that vision to reality?
Yeah. So entire swaths of our city aren't represented on council right now. we've got more than 1 in 5, before the pandemic hit even, more than 1 in 5 of us live in poverty. With the university and LCC, we have tons of young folks, and more than half, I think it's actually now 52% of residents in Eugene are renters. And yet those perspectives don't exist on our city council. And I think the result of that is when it comes time to vote on things like the housing crisis or climate change, things that are very near and dear to my heart, we see these issues treated as more academic questions than as urgent threats. And I think we see that play out whenever these votes pop up. The trouble that we've had over the years, for example, I hate to keep beating this horse, but to make it easier to build ADUs. I know that's just a drop in the bucket in terms of the housing crisis, but it's a great example for, what that lack of urgency looks like. And so my goal in hopefully being elected to council is to bring those perspectives to the table and find areas where we can pick up the pace. I think it's clear there's a common sentiment in our community that council tends to be overly deliberative, process heavy, maybe too methodical or slow would be a blunt way to put it. I think there are ways we can change that. I have a tangible example, and I know I've been talking a lot, but looking at the TAC report, this big homeless systems transformation plan, back during the last budget cycle, I did a bunch of research, put together the numbers, figured out what it would cost for the implementation phase of that program to establish the first 3 staff positions to get us started on, that whole process. I talked with the county budget committee. I made sure that we were getting everything lined up with them, and I brought it to the table, and the motion failed. 2 or 3 months later, council brought up the same exact motion, same numbers I had laid out. It was wrapped in with some other things, but they passed it. And so the reason I mention this is it's an example, again, of that lack of urgency, right? We've got to be finding ways where we can implement these ideas piecemeal if needed, just to pick up the pace. Because if we'd had those 3 staff positions established those 3 months earlier, imagine if we've been able to then, because of that, set up a low barrier public shelter, which these positions were going to be responsible for. And so there are real impacts when we are so plodding and slow to take action on these things. And so that's kind of my core focus. It's what I'm really hoping to accomplish, finding these ways where we don't worry so much about getting the perfect solution in place as long as we find good ones. And it's okay if we make mistakes along the way. These can be iterative processes. We can go back and fix things. But I think that's the key to really picking up the pace.
Well, thank you. It's been enlightening. Do you have a website and way for people to get a hold of you?
Yes.
Clue us in?
Yeah, definitely. So it's very easy to remember. It's www.moreforeugene.com. We've got a contact form on there. If people want to email me. I think also our campaign phone number is listed there. If you want to give me a call, I'm happy to chat. We also have an active Facebook page. Follow us there to stay up to date. We also are doing a lot of phone calls and texting because, the traditional way of running a campaign is you go door to door, talk to voters at the doorstep where they're most comfortable, most willing usually to engage in conversation. Obviously, we can't do that now. So we're getting creative, finding ways to reach voters without being able to do that. And, we'll see what happens May 19th.
No rallies these days.
Yeah, yep.
But hopefully that'll be changing next month. Not in time for the election, but hopefully we'll be able to get out and about and and make some noise anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to end the recording now.
Thanks again for doing this and helping people get informed.
You bet.